Good morning, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. The Making Art in Tudor Britain project has for the first time provided a substantial body of physical evidence concerning Tudor paintings, all portraits. And of course, the evidence is going to continue coming forward over the life of the project. So just some examples here of the wonderful details taken from some of these very familiar portraits. Many of the artists working in Tudor Britain, especially in London, were immigrants. And looking at the larger Northern European context, I want to consider briefly the extent to which the locations in which artists were born, trained, and subsequently employed might have a bearing on the physical and stylistic properties of their work, on their artistic practices. To what extent do immigrant artists retain characteristics distinctive of their origins? Are there distinct and separate native and foreign artistic communities operating in Tudor London? Can we draw any useful distinctions between native and foreign practice that might shed light on some of the works examined in this project? So Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries might at first sight present a highly subdivided and insular appearance, as you see in the map. It was a mass of local languages and dialects, local taxes, there are the forbidding tax collectors waiting to get them, and of course local guild regulations. It was usual for towns to seek to privilege their native families of workers who had resided within the walls for some time, and anyone not born into such privilege would have to buy into it at a high price for those outsiders seeking to establish a business in a new town. In Bruges, an outsider had to pay nearly 30 times as much as the son of a local master. In Cologne, a competent outsider might be accepted on payment of a large fee and a quarter litre of wine for the enjoyment of the craft. Otherwise, they had to serve an apprenticeship of 4 years, even if they were already qualified. In Augsburg in 1471, the artists agreed, none of us, not painters, glaziers, carvers, or gold beaters, will give those who wish or might wish to buy guild rights and privileges any counsel, help, support, or encouragement. One might think that such restrictions in a world of small, highly distinctive communities would be a great constraint on mobility. But this seems not to have been the case. Towns, even if not the guilds themselves, were frequently keen to encourage skilled newcomers, and painters were among the many highly mobile workers in Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. They were attracted to exceptionally prosperous towns with international markets, such as Bruges in the 15th century and the less restrictive Antwerp in the 16th, and to towns such as Nuremberg, with its lack of guilds, its merchant families, and numerous churches. And London also attracted skilled immigrants. Sophie Cassan-Bruquet has drawn attention to the numbers of painters, goldsmiths, and other families of craftspeople from the Low Countries working in London in the 15th century. But the guilds of the City of London were extremely protective of their members. In 1488, the painters petitioned the mayor to resolve the problems caused by the multitude of foreigns repairing daily to the said city. Foreigns, it should be noted, and this will be mentioned again in extracts from the London ordinances, were merely those from outside London who were not free men of the city, rather than the strangers or foreign immigrants. The portrait of the Venetian future Doge, Marco Barbarigo, made when he resided in London from the mid-1440s to at least 1450, as the letter he's holding addressed to him there demonstrates, provides a concrete example of the work of a painter working in London who was clearly trained in the Netherlandish tradition, as can be seen by comparison of its style and format, and also its materials, with this portrait by Van Eyck, also in the National Gallery, Léal's Souvenir. In Barbarigo's portrait, the green background is of verdigris, and the purple hat includes some ultramarine, which is also found in the red robe, eyes and flesh. The purple paint is mixed with linseed oil with a little pine resin. In Léal's Souvenir, ultramarine appears to be present in the red glaze of the red robe. In Léal's souvenir, ultramarine appears... Oh, sorry, I think I've just read that. The medium has not been analysed, but a sample from the famous red headgear of the supposed Van Eyck self-portrait in the National Gallery showed the medium was again linseed oil with a little pine resin. How far such technical similarities between the work of an Eyckian painter in London and that of Van Eyck himself in the Low Countries should be given any significance is debatable, given that these materials are not at all uncommon in Northern Europe at this time, as we shall see. In his catalogue entry, where you can find all this information, Lorne Campbell notes that the quality of the oak panel of the Barbarigo portrait, which hasn't been analysed, is not quite of the standard to be found acting as a support to paintings made at this time in the Low Countries. As already mentioned, there were many painters from the Low Countries documented working in London in the 15th century, and Campbell notes that there was, for example, in 1436, a Henry Hairperson from Holland living in Southwark, a popular location for immigrants. Did such painters work with others from similar areas of Europe in London, or did they ever work with native painters? In the 1466 ordinances of the London Painters' Guild, it was laid down that no member was allowed to work with any foreign painter unless licensed to do so by the wardens. So one might infer that they sometimes did. In 1482, in supplementary ordinances, the wardens were concerned to have the power to seek out deceivably made work by foreigners, made in secret and private places of the said city or other places thereunto nigh adjoining. Crossing the Channel again, I want to turn to some examples of painters working in Germany and the Low Countries who were demonstrably mobile. In Cologne, a painter called Stefan Lochner came from the region of Lake Constance in southern Germany in around 1440. He was already a mature painter and rose to hold the position of town painter, enjoying a highly successful career until he died of the plague in 1451. You can see some of his works here. He owned 2 houses, large houses, in which he ran his workshop. And in Cologne, there were no restrictions at this time on the number of assistants who could be employed. Now, Lochner has been identified as the painter of the famous altarpiece of the Three Kings, now in Cologne Cathedral and formerly in the town hall, you see top left, as a result of interpreting a diary entry made by Albrecht Dürer. He recorded in 1521 that he had paid to have opened the town hall altar of the saints by Meister Stephan. Now, some scholars have questioned the association between the painter of this and other works attributed to Lochner and the documented painter Lochner, an immigrant from southern Constance, on the grounds that the altarpiece and the other works associated with him look very much like earlier work produced in Cologne and not very much like work produced in the area of Lake Constance. This painting by the master of St. Veronica was produced in Cologne in about 1420. Some characteristics of its technique are that the gilding was applied over a warm red earth, the medium used was linseed oil, which had been preheated, and the flesh is painted with lead white mixed with red lake. Lochner's gilding technique was similar in some parts of the painting you see on the left. His media included linseed oil, but may have been slightly more complex, and his colour mixtures are also more complex. But to what extent such differences might be indicative of his different geographical origin is extremely debatable. The paintings are anyway separated by about 30 years, and their styles are clearly more similar to each other than those of southern German paintings of either period. And nor again are these materials particularly distinctive in themselves. Some other examples might suggest that an immigrant painter's absorption of a local style is precisely what leads to success. We can take the example of Hans Memling. He was born near Frankfurt in Germany at about the time Lochner arrived in Cologne, around 1440. By the second half of the 15th century, the style associated with Lochner was becoming outmoded. Netherlandish art was now increasingly fashionable all over Europe, north and south, and the style associated with Roger van der Weyden was widely disseminated. Memling evidently travelled to the Low Countries from Germany at an early stage of his career. He probably trained with Roger van der Weyden himself in Brussels, who evidently ran a very large and extremely successful workshop. Memling then settled in Bruges, where he acquired citizenship and had a highly successful career, many of his clients being Italians from Florence, and one here, Sir John Donne from Wales. We will never know if Memling spoke Flemish with a German accent, but his paintings are indistinguishable from the work of native Flemings. Another example is the painter known as the master of the St. Bartholomew altarpiece, who produced a number of altarpieces for churches and monasteries in Cologne in the latter part of the 15th century. The influence of Roger van der Weyden's great deposition altarpiece, now in the Prado, top right, is clear in this small devotional work of the Descent from the Cross in the National Gallery. Another work here, his Saints Peter and Dorothy, was produced for the largest parish church in Cologne, St. Columba. But this painter seems to have been neither a native of Cologne or of the southern Netherlands made famous by Van Eyck, van der Weyden and Memling. Instead, he seems to have been a native of Utrecht in the northern Netherlands, as can be demonstrated by the presence in one of his paintings of a prayer book in Dutch. Whether he periodically travelled down the Rhine to Cologne to carry out commissions there, or whether he settled and paid his dues to the guild, is impossible to say. The lack of survival of works from the northern Netherlands in this period, as a result of the iconoclasm in the 16th century, makes it difficult to gauge the stylistic or technical distinctiveness of North Netherlandish painting, and hence to assess the extent to which the master's paintings, so successful in Cologne, preserve any regional references. But as with Lochner, there is a clear stylistic relationship to the tradition of painting in Cologne, including the lavish use of gilding, as you see here in this gold damask background. Whereas Netherlandish painters in this period abandoned the use of precious metal early in the 15th century in favour of wholly illusionistic painting techniques, German painters continued to use gilding well into the 16th century, as Holbein's work demonstrates. The 1482 ordinances of the London Painters Guild showed a concern with gilding, wanting to ensure that no painter passed off painted tinfoil for gold, nor used party gold, gold mixed with silver or other metal, for church work rather than pure gold. Interestingly, the 1449 statutes of the Cologne Painters Guild showed exactly the same concerns. He who agrees to gild something with fine gold shall not use divided gold instead, or face a fine of 5 marks. And finally, just to go even further afield, to Venice in the 16th century, where there were a number of German painters documented there who are known to have worked with Venetian painters, particularly in the second half of the 16th century. They must have acquired enough knowledge of Venetian working practices to be useful, and as workshop assistants, they would have been required to work in a manner indistinguishable from their masters. They were obliged to join the Painters Guild there, but this was not made particularly difficult. In 1479, a guild regulation obliged masters to register foreigners with the guild if they worked for more than 3 days, suggesting that Venetian painters took advantage of much foreign labour. The exception to such rules was the famous Albrecht Dürer, whose work you see here, painted on his visit to Venice in 1505-7, who, despite complaints from Venetian painters, refused to join the guild, and as a master of considerable fame, made his own distinctive contributions there before returning to Nuremberg. His intention was, of course, to stand out rather than to blend in. So, coming back to England, take the case of Holbein. Born in Augsburg in southern Germany in 1497-8, he spent just over a decade working in Basel in Switzerland before arriving in England for the first time in autumn 1526. By February 1527, he was working with a band of English painters on the royal revels at Greenwich, and you can see some of the accounts there. And there's his name. Although the extent to which Holbein was able to master the English language in this time remains a mystery, and the place names on the globe in his famous painting of the ambassadors appears to show a guttural South German accent, for example, Baris instead of Paris, you may be able to make out there. He would have had no difficulty with the international language of painting materials and techniques. The very detailed accounts of those Greenwich revels testify to the extent to which the materials he used were those familiar all over Northern Europe. And when Holbein returned to England, and in 1533 painted his great double portrait of the ambassadors, again, his materials were little different. And thank you very much to my colleagues at the National Gallery, especially Joe Kirby, for this very useful slide. Although Lochner, Memling, the master of the St. Bartholomew altarpiece, and Holbein himself may have encountered unaccustomed languages on their travels and varying taxes, guild regulations, and payments, they would have encountered little variation in the materials with which they set to work to paint. The relative uniformity in both materials and working practices in Northern Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries must have greatly encouraged mobility among painters. Even the use of poplar in Italy, rather than the limewood to which he was more accustomed, was no barrier to Jura, and he would presumably have welcomed the easy access in Venice to imported materials, such as the best quality ultramarine. And Joe Kirby has recently demonstrated how the market for pigments and painting materials operated in 15th and 16th century London. There, ultramarine, made from lapis lazuli, was highly expensive. It was used very sparingly in this miniature by Holbein, along with azurite, and Nicholas Hilliard writes of buying ultramarine from Venice, and tells us exactly how expensive it was. But it seems rarely, if ever, to appear in larger scale works. Both native artists and immigrants evidently found the same impediment to its use, namely price. The barriers to the integration of immigrant artists then, if there were any, were created not by differences in materials or working practices, but by institutional structures such as guilds, statutes, and other attempts at the regulation of immigrant workers. In 1492, the ordinances of the Painters' Company of the City of London laid down that no one should employ a foreign painter, i.e. one from outside the city, if they could get a freeman of the city for the same price. Yet, as we've seen, there was a community of immigrant painters, as well as other foreign craftspeople in London in this period, and it was one which grew over the following century. As many as 36% of goldsmiths in London in the 1570s were aliens, and migrants in the second half of the 16th century came from Flanders and Brabant with skills in luxury trades such as goldsmithing and silks textiles, particularly in the 1560s, the religious and political refugees. Painters joined them, including some of the most successful portraitists of the later 16th century, and I know Karen Hearn is going to say more about this later on. Immigrants who became denizens or citizens were allowed to establish workshops and take on apprentices. Lucas Hornbout, working for Henry VIII, achieved this privileged status in 1534 and took on 4 assistants. Actually, 4 has been calculated as the average number of assistants that painters in Germany had in this period. Holbein became a denizen in 1541. though no doubt many others operated outside the law, as he must have done before then, no doubt greatly aided by his status as a royal painter. By taking on assistance, immigrants could prosper, but also preserve and even reinforce their own particular skills and ways of working. So what tentative conclusions, and they can only be extremely tentative, can we draw concerning native and immigrant painters working in London in the 16th century? The materials they used were likely to be almost identical ones shared with painters in the rest of Northern Europe. The collaborative ways in which workshops of painters operated were also well established across Northern Europe, making use of their stock of pattern books of drawings, which they could use as designs for their work or for the repetition of compositions, including portraits, as we see here. It was Netherlandish patterns and ways of paintings which predominated in Northern Europe throughout the 15th century and into the 16th century. These were reflected and absorbed into local practices over a very wide area, and it's unlikely that London, with its settlements of Netherlandish painters, its import of Netherlandish works of art, and its closeness geographically to the Low Countries, would have been any exception, despite the prominence of Holbein, a pattern after whom you see on the left. Antonis More, in the mid-16th century, still represented a highly prestigious type of Netherlandish portrait painting. But of course, for Sir Henry Lee to have this beautiful portrait painted necessitated a visit abroad. Hans Ewers attracted prestigious patrons at home for his portraits of extraordinary quality. The portrait of Lady Dacre and her son is a dazzling display of Netherlandish painting technique, at the same time fluid and precise, as we see in these details. Unlike Memling in Bruges or Lochner in Cologne, there would have been no need for Ewers to adapt to a different style of painting when Netherlandish painting was still so prestigious. Although much evidence still remains to be compiled and assessed, it might be suggested that in their practice, native oil painters in London already had much in common with their highly successful immigrant counterparts. Thank you.